in December 2012 became the basis for current debate over reform that is the centerpiece of the Mexican government's legislative agenda. At the same time, as I mentioned, we have a serious games initiative spearheaded by Dave Rejewski. The challenge we all face now is to have an informed national conversation about our energy future, but only 1 in 10 Americans can pass a basic quiz on energy topics, and I doubt any member of Congress is going to do any better than that, certainly including me as a former. A way forward is sitting on the desktops and in the pockets of 212 million Americans who play video games. For 4 years, we have run the national budget game, Budget Hero, which has been played over 1.7 million times. Built on the models used by the CEO, it turns any player into a budget czar. How we need you right this minute to reopen our government. I hope the people in this very room will help us do something similar with energy and get the energy game onto desktops, laptops, iPads of millions of people, from students to seniors. And, oh, by the way, someone we've discussed this with is our good friend Dan Yergin. The Center was thrilled to publish, along with Johns Hopkins University Press, the second edition of Energy and Security Strategies for a World in Transition. You'll hear from 2 editors of this important volume, whom I'm sure Dan is going to introduce, and who are on today's panel. But now, let me turn over the program to another public high school kid from Los Angeles, Pulitzer Prize winning author and current, I'm one, he's the other one, winning author and current vice chairman of IHS, Dan Yergin. Dan is a contributing author to this book, a great friend of the Wilson Center, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for that great introduction to this project. And I'm very pleased to follow Jane and be able to set the stage for the discussion that's going to ensue. And many congratulations to the Wilson Center, along with Johns Hopkins University, for seeing the importance of this book and sponsoring it. It's almost exactly 40 years ago today that Japanese Prime Minister, was actually at late September of 1973, warned that there was going to come an energy crisis in 10 years. As it turned out, that crisis came in 10 days. As all know, it led to a great upheaval in the world economy, in world politics, changed the role of the United States, raised questions about the role of the United States and its future, and certainly shook Americans who had grown up with decades and decades of that American belief in abundance, and entered what seemed to be an era of permanent scarcity. And for decades, it seems subsequent events borne that out. That event, exactly 40 years ago, really also introduced the modern age of energy, and I think has been the reference point ever since. Because up till then, people really didn't talk about energy. They talked about oil, or they talked about natural gas, or they talked about coal. They didn't talk about wind or solar because they weren't on the agenda. And it was only after that that people really began to talk about energy in an overall way. And Jan Kalitzky and David Goldwyn, with a brilliant sense of timing, have produced the new edition of their book, Energy and Security Strategies for a World in Transition. This is a very important book for anyone who's interested in energy, international affairs, the politics of energy, how markets work. It really is a very illuminating book. And the subtitle also tells you a lot, because the subtitle is Strategies for a World in Transition. And that covers a point that so much has changed. And I was making a list of the changes that we could say have fallen within this 40-year period. And some of them have been unfolding for a long time, such as energy efficiency. U.S. today, very different from back then, is twice as energy efficient. Renewables, born really as a result of the crises of the 1970s, the modern renewables, wind and solar. After what seemed a strong start, they went into what I called in the quest the valley of death. And then they reemerged with the rebirth of renewables at the beginning of this century. Technological innovation continually happening. Only in the last 10 or 15 years has climate change really become part of the energy agenda. Something that's even more recent was really the bursting on the scene around 2004, 2005 as the emerging markets as the critical growth area for energy. And that's a theme that this new edition of Energy and Security focuses on and captures. Of course, the unconventional revolution and what started off as simply as shale gas and then tight oil has reached a scale where it deserves to be called unconventional revolution. At the period of the beginning of the oil crises in that era, natural gas was in such short supply, as some will remember, that you were not allowed to burn it to generate electricity. Now there's a sense of abundance that it's become the default fuel for electric security. And gas is considered to be very abundant, at least everywhere except in Japan, where they don't regard it as abundant. So all of this makes Energy and Security, this new book, so timely. It is interesting, Jan and David, looking back and realizing when the first edition came out in 2005, shale gas really wasn't even on the agenda. And if anybody had a name for shale gas at that time, it was called uneconomic gas. 2005 was just when the impacts of the emerging market demand shock started to be felt. But that first edition was profoundly important. It has had a continuing large impact on U.S. energy policy and thinking. I think this new edition, and it really is virtually a new book, so it shouldn't be just thought of as a revision, will have a similar impact here and around the world. In the first edition, Jan and David press for higher level U.S. government attention and coordination of energy policy. No good deed goes unpunished. So Hillary Clinton thought that was a really good idea and set up this position called the Special Energy Envoy, an international energy coordinator, which gave David, was appointed to that, and that gave him the opportunity to travel all the time. He's not there now, and I'll say in a minute what they're doing, but Carlos Pascual, of course, is taking that position. I think now you'll find in this volume, Jan and David are pushing to connect our energy strategy more deeply, not only to U.S. energy policy, but to the global energy system. They have in the book a potentially quite powerful concept, what they call a global energy security system, GESS. Now, some of you will know in books about how to negotiate and how to resolve issues, there's this phrase about the importance of getting to yes. Now, Jan and David are telling us how to get to guess, and I think it'll be important to hear that. I am told, wanted to hold up the book. I don't know if it's true. I'm told that people who publish books really like it when people hold up their book. So I just thought I would hold up the book for 5 or 10 minutes. But actually, the reason I'm doing that is that I can just read you on the back of this book. We have the executive director of the International Energy Agency, Maria van der Hoeven, saying that this is required reading for those seeking to understand the strategic level importance of energy interests and economics. And at the same time, the Secretary General of OPEC, Abdullah Salam al-Badri, says that this is a thorough, insightful, and compelling analysis of the new challenges and opportunities facing the world energy community. So I think a book that can get those kind of quotes, and there are many others from both the head of the IEA and the head of OPEC, tells it that this is a very important and timely volume. The introductions in the book underline its importance as well. They have 3 introductions. First from Jim Schlesinger, great statesman, founder really of the Department of Energy, and really a leading figure in obviously energy and national strategy for many years. Senator Richard Lugar, the former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, also like Jim Schlesinger, a great statesman, and was forefront of energy security. And I believe it was his legislation, David, that outlined the position that you occupied in the Department of State. And of course, although she popped out, but we're returning Jane Harman, who brings such a profound understanding of international affairs. The book is so rich, and I should say, it's really hard to do a book like this, not only because the content is so broad, but because you're dealing with so many authors, and you have to shepherd them all in to get everything in. And there was a number of times when I felt I was the very last person through the door, and they were quite patient with me.
No, you were not.
Okay, I feel better. But you'll see when you look at the table of contents what an extraordinary group of contributors there are to this book. There are many, it's interesting too that there are many, we have a very different view of our energy endowment in the United States than we did 5 years ago. And yet it's striking, and everybody knows this, energy issues are still very divisive, beginning with the Keystone XL pipeline. The book is organized both thematically, and I contribute the chapter on energy security, and also regionally. We'll hear from Jan, and we'll hear from David, and we'll hear from one of their contributors today, Frank Verrastro from CSIS. I would like to, at this point, to ask the other contributors who are here to just stand so we can introduce them. I think I saw Shakib Khalil come in.
Yes.
If you could stand. We think Bill Ramsey's not here. Is Kevin Book here? Good, Kevin. Stuart Eiler. Great. And Phil Van Nykirk. Now, are there any other authors here who have not been called upon? So let's give them all a hand. Thank you. There are many other contributors and distinguished authors. You might want to look at the chapter on energy technology by this obscure MIT professor named Ernie Moniz. I think it will shed some light, and he did that with energy researcher Melanie Kinderdine, but it will kind of show you where his thinking is. The title is Energy and Security, and that is still the center point of this whole book. And it is so relevant to be considering it here on the 40th anniversary of the first oil crisis. A lot has changed. 40 years ago, there was turmoil in the Middle East. Alignments have changed. 40 years later, there's turmoil in the Middle East, which provides a context. In the chapter that I wrote on energy security, the view I took is that the major risk to supplies in the next decade or two is not geology, but geopolitics. The need to think of energy security in multiple dimensions, not just an oil supply question. And then I tried to outline principles of energy security, and I have about 9 of them, beginning with diversification. And I quote Winston Churchill's famous comment on the eve of the First World War when he converted the British Navy from coal to oil to gain greater speed against the German Navy. People said, well, you're going to just depend upon oil from one country. It's kind of risky. It was Persia, Iran. And he said, well, it's okay as long, he said, but you can do this. But he said, safety in oil lies in variety and variety alone, i.e. the principle of diversification, which is still the central principle of energy security. But I think some of the others that I point to is the importance of the kind of robust dialogue that's really represented in this book among consumers, the new consumers, the traditional consumers, and producers and consumers, innovations, and also something that people often don't think about, but the importance of large, well-functioning markets to adjust to shocks and to adjust much more quickly. There are 2 particular things I wanted to point to. One is something that we hadn't really thought about before, but integrated energy shocks. It's something when oil is down, power is down, gas is down, everything's down at the same time. That's what Katrina and Rita were, those hurricanes, and that's what Superstorm Sandy were. And certainly we need to be prepared for them, and we're not really prepared for them. And the other is, of course, what Jane Harman already referred to, cybersecurity, or what former Defense Secretary Panetta called a cyber Pearl Harbor, and the sense that the energy infrastructure is very vulnerable. And I think as high-risk areas, and the question of how to deal with that. I think on the agenda now, as we look forward, and it comes out of what happened in Hurricanes Rita and Katrina, what happened with Superstorm Sandy, our whole energy security machinery was really built for what's happening out there in the rest of the world, rather than being built for what happens when we have a major regional disruption in the United States. And I think at the top of the agenda, and it's one of the themes of this book, at the top of the agenda is preparing a system to deal with these and being prepared in advance rather than to have to improvise, because there will be other shocks, integrated energy shocks like that in the future. But there is so much more in this book. And I think we should turn it over now to Jan and David to describe some of the themes that are most important to them. Jan was a counselor in the Department of Commerce. He's a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center. He's also the international counselor at Chevron. David Goldwyn was Assistant Secretary of Energy, and then, of course, as I said, was the International Envoy for Energy, is now the president of Goldwyn Energy Strategies. So Jan and David will give you a little time, and then we'll hear from Frank, who holds the Schlesinger Chair appropriately at CSIS, and then we'll kind of move into a broader discussion. So, gentlemen.
Well, thank you, Dan.
I may as well hold this up one more
Yeah,
time.
please, keep on holding it up. Thank you, Dan. Those were very interesting and very generous remarks. And Dan is a good friend, an energy guru, and truth be told, the godfather of our two energy and security books, as well as the author of a key chapter on energy security, and one that was equally interesting in the first edition. Actually, Dan, I was thinking of calling you the Yoda of the energy Star Wars, but I decided to settle for just a slightly ominous term, that of Godfather. So, just wanted you to know that. And I want to thank Jane. I don't think she's back yet, but she's been tremendous in hosting this book launch, and she wrote a wonderful foreword, along with those, as Dan mentioned, by Secretary Jim Schlesinger and Senator Dick Lugar. They really are wonderful in their own right. They're not just patting us on the head. They're talking about their view of where energy is and where it's going. Each of us have only a few minutes because we want to have a little bit of an interaction here in the panel, and Dan has promised to provoke us into saying all sorts of irresponsible things. But I will just take a few minutes. I'll keep some powder dry, and I'll just make 4 points about the book. First, the energy world, as we've heard, and as we're aware, has turned almost 180 degrees since we wrote the first edition in 2005. We all thought we were so smart then. The name of the game was to manage growing energy dependence. Well, now it's the opposite, so it's time for a new book. And maybe we'll even get to the point where some people think we can have energy independence, and I'll have a few words about that in a moment. Second, the big reason for this, and Dan referred to those two MIT scholars, those obscure scholars, Ernie Moniz and Melanie Kenderdine, is of course technology. And that is huge in the energy business. And it's interesting to me how much people say, well, they're the low-tech people, who do these commodities, and then they're high-tech people sitting around in Silicon Valley. Well, come and visit the 3D visualization labs that we have, or come and take a look at those amazing offshore structures. It really is seriously advanced technology. And that is the reason, I think, more than anything else, that we can expect North America to be the equal, not only of Russia, but of Saudi Arabia, within years, maybe not days. But, we are in a very different position today than we were at the time of the oil embargo. Different in energy terms, different in strategic terms. And that's worth some discussion. Third, even if North American energy independence were to become achievable someday, I think it's fair to say that we all feel that this would be a terrible mistake to pursue such a strategy. Now, I know you'll find this inconceivable, but I regret to report that many politicians and all presidents since Richard Nixon had it all wrong about energy independence. It's surprising that that's the case, but politicians can be wrong sometimes. And I feel actually that even though we have such an endowment that we're now developing here in the US, we have now also enormous energy negotiating power, and we should be using it. For example, to get a level playing field in energy trade, not conceivable 40 years ago, to gain increased access for energy investment, to pursue regional goals, from true European energy security to a new energy and environment compact for the Arctic, and to guarantee oil and gas supplies to good allies, for example, Japan, when we ask them to take risks as we have with sanctions against Iran. It's time, in other words, to connect the dots between foreign policy and energy policy, rather than pretending that they're in separate buildings. And we don't want to talk to each other about what that means. So this brings me to a fourth and final point about our book. In our first edition, we called for an integrated energy and foreign policy strategy for the U.S. And there has been some progress, notably a new Energy Resources Bureau at State, and now a ramping up, I think, of the international policy function at DOE. No doubt there's still plenty of room for progress, and we might want to get into that, but I think it's a significant plus. In our second edition, our authors and we recognize that it's not just about our getting our own act together here in the U.S., at the state and the federal levels and between business and government and amongst the different regions in the country which have very different energy views, postures, requirements. What we recognize in the second book is that purely national strategies will not achieve true energy security. It's intertwined with economic and climate and global security issues. So that's why we're advocating this strange acronym, which we're calling GESS, as in a global energy security system, that looks for win-win rather than zero-sum solutions. The hallmark of GESS for me is energy interdependence, not isolation or energy trade wars. I know David will go into this in more detail, but overall, I think this should mean free energy trade, two-way investment, and serious greenhouse gas reduction. Not only that, we think GESS should mean enhanced engagement between consumers and producers. For one thing, the consumers are now producing, and the producers are consuming. And we should be in the position of forecasting better supply and demand, responding to supply disruptions precisely, quickly, and effectively. So steps like these, we think, are the building blocks for energy interdependence, leading to technology cooperation, greater energy access, the global reserve network, safe, fuel-powered economic growth. And we realize that this depends on sustained U.S. technology leadership and increased U.S. energy leverage, which are within our grasp. The footnote, of course, is politics, and I'll leave that to Frank. Frank will leave it somewhere else. But it also depends on increased bilateral and multilateral cooperation. And we think we can have that too, as the energy landscape changes fundamentally and as each country's energy security requirements are changing with it. So we think getting to GESS means global energy strategies to match global energy markets. Bilateral and regional building blocks abound for such strategies. After decades of impasse, China and the U.S. are stepping up cooperation against greenhouse gases. The U.S., EU, and Russia are cooperating in energy efficiency. Saudi Arabia is cutting back consumption. It's investing in solar energy. If you look at it regionally, the Arctic Council is preparing to promote energy development and protect the sensitive polar environment. And globally, all countries can and must combat energy poverty and avert the shortages and outages that further destabilize countries like Pakistan or Yemen. So to conclude, we think GESS can translate into a win-win agenda well suited to the challenges of the 21st century, as opposed to the zero-sum agenda of oil embargoes and producer-consumer confrontation. Now, I'm not saying it's all going to be great. I'm just saying this is the trend. Obviously, there will be tensions and confrontations in the future. But the trend, if we play our energy cards right, will be that of a global energy security system. And that means that just as in all economic matters or trade matters or investment matters, we have to fight the calls for protectionism, and we have to advance globally a new and cooperative energy economic system in which energy obviously is a central part. So on this note, I'll turn over to my good friend and co-editor, David Goldwyn, who will, I'm sure, tell us how we do this all.
Thanks, Jan. And let me add my thanks to the Wilson Center and to Dan, who really for decades you've been so generous with your time and your wisdom and your guidance and your encouragement, and Jan and I think both deeply appreciate that. And Jan, for your leadership for getting me into this project and saying it'll be easy, it'll be fine. But
Yeah,
that-
I'm sure
that
this time he
tremendous
said,
energy.
I'm sure he said this time will be much easier.
Much easier.
But really is, thank you for your leadership, or this book would not have been possible. Wearing my old policy hat, you can't present a problem to the world without saying, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to recommend? And as we have thought about these issues and seen the wisdom of all of our contributing editors, we have extracted, I think this morning, 8 of the key policy prescriptions that people recommend. But the first line of the book says that the American energy landscape has changed, but public perceptions have not yet caught up with it. And this is really the challenge. We are used to this world of scarcity, of dependence. And the idea that we have enough, that we have surplus, that we can move it out of the country is very hard to people to accept. But we and many of our contributors think that we are really at a pivotal moment in American national power. We have the ability to engage the rest of the world and reduce the concentration of natural resources worldwide. We have the ability to get some short-term gains in greenhouse gas reduction. We have the ability to democratize access to energy in other parts of the world. We have a real chance at making a dent in energy poverty and a chance to revive the American economy. So these are great opportunities if we can seize them, but it is by no means a given because the fear of change is so great. And so we look at our top 8 recommendations, and the first one is to use energy as a foreign policy tool to seriously erode the monopolization and price influence of concentrations of oil and gas around the world. And you do that by exports. So we're talking about embracing exports of liquefied natural gas, pipe gas as well. And to the extent we have surplus grades of oil, light oil these days, talking about exports of oil too. Now, why does that matter? Well, just the fact that we consumed more gas led to an erosion in the correlation between the price of gas and oil. Gas is priced close to oil. So Europe got a gas price break because we didn't need so much LNG anymore. If we join the world as serious LNG exporters, that's an economic dividend. That's quantitative easing 4. That makes gas more affordable when it's way more expensive than coal in developing parts of the world. It gives us a chance to introduce competition into the market in a market that is subject to monopolization now. Think Russia and Central Europe, Russia and Eastern Europe, other parts of the world that have one supplier. This is a huge step forward. And to the extent that we can participate in the oil market and introduce competition on the price of oil too, we have spent 40 years trying to do, which is make this market competitive and not monopolistic. And you can see some of the potential benefits. Right now, Japan, post-Fukushima, what do they need to keep their economy going? Gas. What are they burning? Some coal, some oil. If we had the ability to help them directly, that's a plus. We ask countries not to import Iranian oil and to build coalitions around that, and we rely on their virtue and their wisdom, but it'd be nice to give them the oil also and to give them an alternative source of supply. You look at the trade talks around the world now, Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic. Why is Japan in TPP? Why are these countries interested? It's the potential to get access to gas. So it's an enormously powerful tool that would be good if we can embrace. The second thing is we have to sustain this boom and allow the infrastructure to be built to move it around the country. We can't move oil or gas from the Gulf Coast to the East Coast because of the Jones Act. It takes years and years sometimes, to permit infrastructure to move oil north-south or east-west. We've got to see that this is an advantage to the economy and accelerate it. Third, we need to take this opportunity to invest in a long-term low-carbon economy. I think everyone agrees gas is better than coal, 50% of the carbon emissions. It's great, but you can't get to an 80% reduction by 2050 with gas. It's a bridge, not a destination. But in order to get there, you need utility-scale storage. You need carbon sequestration. And neither of those technologies are available within the next decade, maybe the next 15 years. So while we're grabbing those short-term reductions by moving from coal to gas, we need to be investing in the R&D for the long term, which is to make renewable energy competitive. And we can't have a carbon tax, which I think 10 or 15 of the contributors to the book believe is the wisest course. Then we have to stop fighting the regulation of emissions at the source, like the coal regulations we have now. The third thing we need to do is spread, or the fourth rather, is to spread the wealth. And by this we mean propagating these technologies overseas, and this is the democratization of access to energy. If we help China, places in Latin America, even North Africa, if we help them understand the technology, but also the environmental regulation and the frameworks they need to attract investment in unconventionals and produce their own oil and gas, we are better off from a climate perspective, an economic perspective, and a security perspective. The next recommendation that we have, and Charlie Ebinger has a terrific chapter on this, is to seriously address energy poverty. And if you look at trends around the world, enormous population growth in South Asia and Africa, enormous urbanization in those same two places. Also, food scarcity and water scarcity. So those countries will either have access to electricity, or you'll still have 2 billion people without access to it. But where are they going to get their baseload? It's not going to be renewable energy to start with, some off-grid applications. So penetration of gas, access to electricity will be key. But none of these countries are going to attract investment for electricity unless they have the frameworks to do it. So we've got to ramp up our investment and also get the World Bank, the IMF, and others to work on using diplomacy to get those countries to create the frameworks that are likely to attract investment in electricity and energy. And things that we can do on energy efficiency are part of that. The agenda on governance and transparency is part of that. One of the ways you get investment in is if you're sure you can get your investment out. The framework won't change, but also that you can get through without having to pay off your way. And there have been strides, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, new standards by the IMF, the Equator Principles. There's lots of progress in this area, but it needs to be a foreign policy agenda. And I think there's been progress, but we're not as far as we need to. The next is a broad category, what Jan talked about using diplomacy and this interdependence to make change. But if you look at our relationship with China, China is dependent on the Middle East for most of its energy. China is dependent on U.S. military power for the security of that transportation. The U.S. cares about using diplomacy, ideally, to create, resolve conflicts. So China has an interest in success of diplomacy. So we now have something in common with the Chinese, and maybe a better chance to get their support for diplomacy, because if it goes to military action, their prices go up. Their economy gets hurt much worse than ours because we don't have that physical supply. So it's a bit of a triangle, but it can work. The pivot to Asia. What does the pivot to Asia mean besides 2 military deployments and the president not being able to travel to the ASEAN summit? How about we do something like a pivot to Asia, like help Asia with its energy and security, particularly China, Japan, Korea, you name it. So that's an area where we can use this triangulation. And even the relationship with Saudi Arabia, which will remain important for decades, whether or not they can have the cushion of spare capacity they've had in the past. But Saudi Arabia is burning oil for electricity. They want to do solar. They need energy efficiency. We have something, finally, we have something they want because it's no longer the market. And so that's an opportunity for diplomacy. It's good to have something that the other side wants. 2 more, modernizing international energy governance and responses to supply disruption. We built the International Energy Agency in a world where we had 80% of the people who are energy consumers in the basket. They're not there. Chinese don't really want to be in that club, and the Indians can't yet for a variety of reasons. But this world has changed, and we need a configuration that brings them in. And now that we have declining oil imports and this enormous reserve, we are likely to respond to a disruption by putting oil onto the market, not simply by replacing imports. That's a pretty powerful tool, especially when you're talking to another country about an action, take Iran for a country, that might result in a disruption, but we have an ability to respond. We've never been able to do that before in a serious, credible way. We've never had the policy organization to be able to deliver that message. That's an opportunity we should take. And that leads me to the last recommendation we have, which is to organize for change. Our government is terribly ill-equipped to deal with what Leon Firth has called these complex energy systems. We have 14 different agencies, each with their own agenda. We have nobody at the White House who is in charge of energy. We have 3 or 4 people. We have the National Security Staff, we have the Domestic Policy Council, we have the National Economic Council at times. There is no one principal. Carol Browner the first 2 years, but that council is gone. It is impossible to herd agencies together behind an agenda in the best of times. But if you don't have a principal, if you don't have someone who is thinking through the intersection of these issues with the clout to make policy, you have no chance of doing anything other than being reactive. And things are complicated enough. Reactivity is not a strategy and not a policy. So I think there are some skeptics, John Deutsch, I think, chief among them, about whether we can actually pull this off. But I think a lot of consensus. Frank, I think, and Dan and Jan and I who think that, that this kind of leadership is essential. And in the last book, we said it needed to happen at the State Department, and it did. But frankly, what I learned from being at the State Department is you can't wag the U.S. government dog from the State Department tail. There's a lot of people out there. You've got energy, you've got trade, you've got a lot of things going on. It has to come from the White House. You have to have that leadership. So that's our last recommendation, is to organize for change, because this opportunity really is tremendous. But it doesn't happen without leadership. It doesn't happen without persuasion. It doesn't happen without program. And we're not there yet, but the opportunity is too good to let it go.
Thank you, David. I think that Jan and David have very effectively, in a crystalline way, captured some of the major themes of the book in terms of both the major changes and the policy issues. Our next two speakers will take them up, except you'll notice that we only have one next speaker. And the other next speaker, Shirley Neff, who was the senior advisor at the Energy Information Administration, is a casualty of the shutdown and apparently is not permitted in a federal building today. So Frank is Verastro, who in addition to being the Schlesinger Chair at CSIS for Geopolitics and Energy, also has served in senior positions both Department of Energy and in the White House. Will cover the wider themes. And I think, Frank, to kind of set it up, David had a lot of shoulds in his remarks. And now, what about the politics of all of this? And I think that's what you're going to take up now.
Yeah, what about the coulds? So thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. First off, I'd like to, just on a personal level, thank Kevin Book, who is our co-author in our chapter, and Molly Walton and Michelle Melton that helped enormously. My background is predominantly in the private sector. I spent 25 years. I was a senior VP at Pennzoil, did international negotiations, did domestic policy, was also in the White House and DOE. But my perspective is a little bit different. So what I've been asked to talk to you about today is talk about the implications of the rise in U.S. production, what the revolution means, how it goes forward, and I think the shoulds and the coulds and what needs to be done to realize this potential is extremely important, because it's by no means a sure thing. The role of the private sector in investment and timing, and then I'll get on the politics a little bit, which in this city you could spend a day and a half about. When we talk about the resource assessment, and Dan talked about, we've all talked about it in terms of a revolution, and it's really hard to overstate the implications of the rise in shale gas and tight oil and the unconventionals just generally. When you go back even 6 years ago and the United States looked to be import dependent, Trinidad, Tobago, Canada, in terms of natural gas and spending a lot of money. And our oil imports, when we testified, we were looking at 60% import dependence. It's now below 40. And in terms of balance of payments in $105 a barrel energy world, this is extremely important. But from a foreign policy perspective, investment perspective, David talked about the triangle. We did a triangle for the National Petroleum Council study 7 years ago now. And it talked about how the U.S., when you formulate policy, you look at economic, foreign policy, national security, and environment. And policy, public policy, is a trade-off between all three. So getting to the best energy policy, it's always subordinate to foreign policy or economic concerns or political concerns, and it's the trade-offs. Efficiency is the only thing that hits the sweet spot. In terms of the gas development, as Dan said, this is relatively new. You go back to 2006, 2007, shale gas was just being developed. But the resource assessment is huge. And this is both technology and price-driven. So it was horizontal drilling, and it was hydraulic fracturing, but it was also $13 gas that led a lot of people into these fields. And it was also developed on private lands because we have subsurface mineral rights that are owned by the private sector. So in company and individuals, as companies went in to drill these prospects, they saw that there was a lot of gas there, and we were actually in the source rock. So it was actually generating hydrocarbons. There is zero geologic risk. Extremely important. So instead of going out and finding these gas fields, once you're in the source rock, it's more like a manufacturing process where you turn it on and off. And during the NPC study, when we looked at the resource assessment, the early assessments were 800 TCF, 800 trillion cubic feet. Then it got to 1,500, and it got to 2,500. And then some of the outliers were 4,500 trillion cubic feet. When the Canadians came down and looked at North America as a whole, they were presenting numbers like 8,000 to 10,000 trillion cubic feet. So if you've been in the private sector, this is infinity, and this is 10,000 trillion cubic feet. So the ads you see on TV for 200-year supply or 250-year supply at current rates, that's where they come from. But the technology component that both Jan and David talked about is also key, because as we're able now to drill 6-mile deep wells, 6 miles deep, we can drill laterals that are 2.5, 3 miles. And with a diagnostic on the back of the drill bit, you can actually hit with a home computer, drilling from here, go past the Capitol, drill down 4 miles, go out 2.5, and hit a prospect the size of a chair.
But can you solve the budget crisis?
That we leave to the people in the Capitol and at the other end of Pennsylvania. But this is really important stuff. And now that we're finding that these structures are tiered, so in the Marcellus is 7,000 to 9,000 feet, but below the Marcellus is the Utica. Below the Utica is the Ordovician. Below the Ordovician is the Mahogany Zone. We can be in these prospects for years and years, and so you won't always have those fluctuations driving prices up and down. The fact that gas has penetrated the power generation sector and reduced coal is good for the environment. It's also allowed us to get to the point where we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but the export of coal and the ability to both become a net exporter of natural gas has changed our position in the world. So when people talk about the impacts of the revolution, the future tense, it's already taking hold now, economically, environmentally, and I would argue geopolitically. On the oil side, we took the same technology, and when we started looking at the oil plays, the tight oil plays, we thought there was 5, and then there was 8, and then there was 10, and then there was the Sweet 16, and now there's 22. And these are in very different parts of the country from which we had historical production in the past. In the past, 80% of our oil came from 4 states, Texas, Louisiana, Alaska, and California. And now North Dakota is the second largest producing state in the United States. And in the last 5 or 6 years alone, our liquids production, we talked about Saudi Arabia, our liquids production in the United States, if you add refinery gain and biofuels in addition to natural gas liquids and crude oil, we're already over 11 million barrels a day. We're rivaling Saudi Arabia now. And our gas production is #1 in the world, and overall, we are a net exporter of petroleum products. This is enormous for the United States. And then when you take it from a policy perspective, as Dan talked about at the beginning, 40 years ago, go back to the embargo, our policy was premised on resource scarcity and growing demand. And as IHS CERA pointed out, in 2006, we probably peaked with petroleum demand in this country. And if the resources are that large, and a little different view of the world on tight oil, but if the resources are that large, then our policy prescriptions have to change. So good things came out of the embargo, the formation of the IEA, the creation of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, CAFE standards, decontrol of oil, decontrol of natural gas. These were all good things. And at the same time, when you talk about the inability of government to function, we also passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the OCS Lands Act amendments in that same period under Democratic and Republican administrations. So the world has totally changed, but our institutions need to change too. And as David alluded to, when the IEA was formed, the OECD were the major demand centers around the world. And now we have these emerging economies that really aren't covered by the IEA. So data collection, how you get these people to play, is the obligation better than the benefit, and how you get them to go along. But the world is changing, just like the G8 has morphed into the G20. So our foreign policy needs to change as well. I may have a slightly different perspective on how we use this as a foreign policy tool. We've argued in the past that we don't like when Russia uses energy as a foreign policy tool, and I would remind my colleagues that a lot of this production is owned by private sector companies and investors. So, dedicating certain volumes of oil, other than the SPR, to countries around the world disproportionately may cause some problems with trade. But I am concerned about this notion of the United States turning inwards, that if we have this resource abundance now and energy independence, that we don't need the Middle East, or we don't need to see development of Africa, or we're not concerned about China. It's a very dangerous path to go down. We've always viewed global energy trade, it's the largest globally traded commodity in the world, as a good thing. And I would argue, too, that if we become so reliant that we keep it domestically in the United States and keep prices lower, so I'm in favor of exports, that you run into a situation that if we have a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico and 40% of our refining goes down, we're going to need to import product. I would also note that, and I think Sarah at IHS is doing work on this now, that on the tight oil side, the homogeneity of the resource base isn't the same as on the shale gas side. So what we're finding, there are sweet spots, there are economic spots that work better than others. The United States could be in a really good position from 2016, 2017 through 2026 or 27, but we're not sure how fast, how high, and how long the production stays up. And if we don't get demand down and move to alternatives, we may be again in the market. So as we start picking winners and losers and look at the geopolitical implications, we just need to be smart about it. I would argue the policy that we had for the last 30 or 40 years worked pretty well, but I totally agree that the world has changed, and we have to take cognizance of the change and be smart about what we do about it, including infrastructure build and policies that make sense. And now just 2 minutes on the politics. So given my background, I was a bit surprised when Jan came to me and asked me to write a political chapter, which in this town is just, it's the kiss of death. Why would you do that? So my first phone call was to Kevin and said, I will only do this if we can do this together, and we have a sense of humor about it. And what we came to was kind of a view in part of the administration's policy, and we all knew the Obama people pretty well. The world that this group, this administration came into, so think back to 2006 during the campaign, 6, 7, 8. Oil prices in 2006 were $35. Summer of 2007, they were $65. And by the summer of 2008, just before the convention, they were 150, right? We had just come off the peak oil theory that we were running out of oil, or that we had suppliers that didn't like the United States were repaying for both sides of the war on terror. And we had Copenhagen coming up at the end of the year. So this notion to drive energy and environment together in the person of Carol Browner, but also as a policy, made infinite good sense. Reducing our imports bill, getting on the alternative road, get to cleaner, low-carbon energy, the selection of Steve Chu as the Secretary of Energy, probably the Secretary of New Energy Research, right? It was a different time. And then we found all this gas. And gas was acceptable because gas displaces coal, right? So as a near term, and we can argue whether it's the bridge or the destination, but we have a lot of gas. And then we found all this oil. And so now I think the big dilemma for us all is when you confront issues like Jan said that go across nations, so these are horizontal issues, not vertical or stovepipe issues. They're common good issues. What do you do about the climate? If you perpetuate a fossil fuel future, and I would argue that with the unconventionals now, you've extended your fossil fuel future. So Saudi Arabia need not be concerned, but we still need to get new research, keep mandates for alternatives, renewable fuel standards, do something about nuclear. We still need to promote the research on carbon capture and storage at scale. That's enormous if you're concerned about seismicity and other things. Think about pumping down carbon and hoping it stays in the ground for 1,000 years. So just to finalize on the political side, when we talked about the policy, we had 3 recommendations going forward, and this was written over a year ago. I think they still stand up. The first one was this comprehensive narrative that we'd all like to see, and I thought that would be a good thing, only in the sense that if you tell the whole story, economic, environment, and energy, it takes the focus off any individual issue like Keystone or exports, right? Administration chose not to do that. Our second theory was that they go with a push the green button idea, that with a divided Congress, that regulatory-wise, we've got a Supreme Court decision on greenhouse gas emissions, that EPA would just regulate and it would litigate. The third option was this give a little, take a little, and I think we're somewhere between the green button and the give a little, take a little, that you do things that are good for the economy and good for energy security, and you balance them with things that are good for the environment as you observe and watch how the world changes. And the world is changing in every facet that we know.
Great.
And I'll leave it at that.
Well, let's, what we'll do is we'll have a little dialogue here. We started a little late, so maybe we'll go about 5 minutes, but we do want to be able to open it up to discussions and questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask our 2 editors and our contributors to all have pretty short answers here. Let me start first with where Frank left off. So we're talking about exports, in which you were. There's a disagreement to some degree between the two of you as to whether this is a foreign policy tool for the United States. What are the politics of exports now? Has things calmed down on LNG exports? And are we going to see a big battle or not about exporting crude oil?
Well, I'll jump in. I think on LNG exports, I think the debate is calming down a little bit. I think it's starting to sink in both in the public and the Congress that conditional approvals to export LNG are not the same as actual exports of LNG. It takes a very long time to permit the projects. They haven't reached final investment decision. So I think there's a little less worry about that. I think, second, I think as the data improves each year, that delta between how much people think we might possibly need for gas, for power, and for transportation and everything else widens, and there's a little bit more comfort. But things are moving slowly. But I think, 2 years from now, it's like a frog boiling in water. I think, once you have a few of these out there, people will calm down and see the forward curve doesn't move. Oil is harder. No one wants to be the White House press secretary who stands up and says, we're still importing oil, but I'm for oil exports. But I think when it starts to impact jobs and starts to impact production, as I think is inevitable, then I think you'll start to
So
see
do you all think this will be a hot topic in 2014?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're in vehement agreement on this one. Absolutely, that it's one of those situations that, to me, there's this myth in the foreign policy community, and I think it's a myth, that our energy independence has limited our foreign policy options. And every time I hear it, I always say, really, where? We had 2 wars in the Middle East. We raised prices. We had sanctions against 3 major producing companies. And I would argue that energy policy has always been subordinate to domestic politics and what the issue of the day is, and most often gasoline prices. And I think that that's where the crunch comes in. And I totally agree that on the gas side, there's more than enough gas that seems to be available, especially in the source rock, and that we could do wonderful things by exporting gas and the technology that goes along with the gas.
But on oil, because that's...
Oil is trickier, and I think the reason oil is trickier is because as you tell people that we become resource rich, their inclination is to ask, why aren't my gasoline prices going down? Right? And so they equate the two, and in a globally traded market, that's not where you want pieces to be. So it's a tougher explanation, and if you're going to export American oil when it can be used for American jobs, it's a tougher sell. I actually think people will get used to it as long as things don't change. But in the current climate, it's a much higher hurdle.
I guess imports and net imports is a harder concept to explain, and but it all balances out. So the two of you disagree about whether this energy abundance gives a U.S. foreign policy tools that it didn't have. I guess you're saying it wasn't a constraint before, it's not a constraint.
I just think there's limitations. I think it's easy to say that if you're in a different position now, you're going to act totally differently. And we're still a major, I take your point on Saudi Arabia, right? That we can rival them in terms of production, but our demand is 18 million barrels a day. Their demand is 2.5, right? So the reason they're a huge net exporter is because they've managed that. And they're moving into gas and they're using solar. This is just smart. Why would you burn $100 oil for power generation and desalinization? I just think it's a tougher sell.
So Ian, let me
ahead.
ask you then, how does the U.S. foreign policy change, because we now have a lot of gas and we're importing less oil? What's different?
Well, I think
policy-wise?
from a foreign policy standpoint, the fact is that, taking the Saudi example that Frank has given us, the Saudis have a set of challenges which is much more similar to the set of challenges that we have here. The Saudis are much more concerned, for example, about consuming less in order to be able to husband the resource and export more and get more economic benefit from it. They don't like the idea they're using oil to generate electricity. They do understand that they have to have renewables
No,
in their
but the question
portfolio.
is, how does it change what the U.S. does in foreign policy? What's different because we're importing less oil and we're not importing gas, aside from the fact that we're saving money?
Well, I think in foreign policy terms, it means very much that other countries view us as a much more relevant player in the energy environment. What the problem is what we started with, which is that we don't understand that. We're limited, frankly, much more by our own deficits, our deficits in understanding and our deficits in integrating. The point that Frank made about narrative, unfortunately, there are people down Pennsylvania Avenue who don't have a clue about narratives, and that's why we're suffering so much. If we were able to do that and have an integrated approach, we could do a lot more in any policy domain, but certainly in the energy area.
Dan, if I could jump in also, I think we are much freer to have a say on on how we declare ourselves on democracy, on human rights, on other countries than we felt in the past. I mean, I think there's any question that for years when we were the primary importer, we were the source of incremental demand, that we were worried about offending and getting retaliation from OPEC. Now it's about Asia. It's not about us anymore. So I think we have lost that threat, and so for good or sometimes for ill, I think we feel a much wider latitude in a place like, for example, Nigeria, to say, we have some investment there, but we really want to have a louder voice on democracy or on governance, or we want to condition our aid, or these are the issues we want to focus on. And I think you've seen that even in the last couple of years.
So it's more a function of degree, because I don't disagree with that. I think that if you add incremental barrels to the world market, right, so you've got multiple suppliers, that on the plus side, you can impact the economics of energy, you can advance the cleaner energy forms, you can sustain economies and help partners as well as emerging economies. The other side of that is that I also think new trading relationships will also form, right?
Right.
So as the U.S. backs away from, pick a country, that as Asia picks up because incremental demand that they need, you may find more investment in Africa or the Middle East, and that's something that we ought to be cognizant of. So I'm not saying that there is no benefit on the foreign policy side. I just don't want to overdo what this position allows us to do in the global market.
Let me jump into that, because I think our choice of goals for using this leverage that we have is very important. If we play a significant international role in the energy area, which impacts, for example, the European security setting vis-a-vis Russia, that I think is a very relevant direct impact. And we're credible in talking about it. But if we have major democratic crisis here at home, and we do, and this is out of the energy area, but my personal view is we're in deep trouble in terms of our democracy. It doesn't make sense to me to go around saying, well, now we're, more powerful, we're going to tell you how to run your democratic system. It just doesn't make sense. We have to have credibility at home about the things that we ask for abroad. We have credibility at home in energy in the way that we didn't have before. So we can bring things to the table in terms of creating the right framework for energy development, creating the right framework for competition and stopping monopolies. But we can't, I would argue against linkage, even though I believe strongly in human rights and democracy, because I don't think our country has a credible position currently on that as it did in the past. And my answer would be, fix your own problems first, then go around encouraging other people. By and large, I mean, you still intervene, obviously, where there's real problems and abuses, but I don't think the energy leverage is, to differ with my co-editor here.
Well, let me make a suggestion.
Relates to that.
I mean, you can see, for instance, talking to a country like Japan about both its own energy problems, its imports, cutting its imports from Iran, but you do see that maybe the way to see it is that this gives an additional dimension to U.S. influence in international affairs in a form that we haven't had before, in a balancing thing. I do think, as one person in this audience asked me yesterday, a non-American, about what's actually happening here in Washington, this is probably not a good week for the U.S. to be lecturing other countries on the advantages of democracy until we get through this. We've seen big impacts, not only in energy terms, which we've talked about, but economic terms, from what's happened with this unconventional revolution. Over 2 million jobs, $1,200 gain in disposable income for households. But I was looking at the most recent Pew opinion poll research, and it said that 65% of Americans support Keystone, 48% are opposed to hydraulic fracturing, otherwise known as fracking. Comment on the role of public opinion on both of these energy developments, and will they impede the continued development of unconventional resource? How big is that threat there? and do you want to make a bet as to whether public opinion will be borne out on a Keystone decision? Any or any shoulds in here? So toss it to all you guys for crisp, sharp answers.
Well, I would say local public opinion matters greatly on hydraulic fracturing, less than national. If you are in a place, you are in a state, your story to how you're going to deal with air and water and disruption matters a lot. And if you can persuade the local people, either because they're benefiting directly, you have a good story, you're fine. If not, you're not getting in. And that's true everywhere around the world. So I think local matters. Keystone is different. And there it's national opinion, and it's I think it's not broad public opinion, it's constituency politics. And for the Obama administration, it is the environmental movement and it's the unions. And broad public opinion doesn't really play into it that much. And so this will come down to whether or not the science on the actual greenhouse gas emissions of the pipeline, which in 3 studies have been declared to be relatively zero, gets plussed up by the Canadian government by something that they're going to do domestically to show that that's negative. And that will be an environmental win, because Canada's greenhouse gas emissions will be seen to be on a more secure downward path. And that might be enough for them to say yes.
Do you think it is emissions related to Keystone, or do you think this is just about the oil sands development in
Yeah,
general?
it's the proxy for climate change. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. In the current environment, I totally agree with David on the fracking issue. Population density is another thing. In North Dakota, before the boom, it was 10 people per square mile was the average population. In parts of Pennsylvania, so this is the eastern portion of Marcellus, it's 60,000. So the things that you do above ground, road construction, noise, pollution, water, amount of trucks for fracking, it really makes a difference. And companies, I think, are going out of their way to get this social license to operate. And it's not only here, it's also in Canada. But I think on the Keystone pipeline, it's been so politicized now that it's the proxy for not having a carbon agenda. And so if you think about the delivery system, it makes a lot of sense.
What's distressing to me is whatever position you take on Keystone, the lack of attention to the Canadian perspective. It's truly those Canadians, in the meantime, let's argue about what we here do. But the Canadians are a major partner, and not only that, they have alternatives. If they don't send it down through the U.S., there are other countries would be delighted to pick it up. And what do we suppose that does then in the aggregate in terms of climate change issues? Isn't it better to think about solidarity with Canada and with Mexico, not just on energy, but on climate and all sorts of other issues, and then put an issue like Keystone in that context? I mean, if I were, an ally and a partner of the United States, I would appreciate that degree of consideration, or at least discussion, and yet it's almost inconceivable that people here in Washington would bother to find out the Canadian perspective on something like
Well,
this.
of course, natural resource is about 20% of Canada's GDP, so it looms very large.
Right.
The other thing that I'm struck by is just if you're looking at carbon footprint, if it isn't Canadian oil sands in those Gulf Coast refineries, it'll be Venezuelan heavy crude, which has just about the same carbon footprint. And so
Right.
that's kind of not been part of the discussion. But that does get to the question that has been raised here. How does the domestic development, shale gas, tight oil, how does that relate to climate change agenda? Or is it just a question that the molecules are coming from here, not there?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Leon Firth, who was Al Gore's, national security deputy, wrote a chapter in here, and he views fracking as a huge positive. He is very concerned about climate change, national security issue, and thinks we're not even close to addressing it. But he thinks that, from an environmental point of view, that substitution for coal, the short-term gains, are very significant here and worldwide. So I think in terms of the climate agenda, from the macroeconomic point of view, it's a huge positive, and I think a lot of people see it that way. I think there's been a curve of education on whether or not the direct environmental consequences are manageable, and it went from disclosure, where the industry badly misstepped, to then the question of whether you could there would be damage to aquifers, which I think has been largely resolved by safety rules and learning about casing. And now it's methane leakage, where we don't really have enough data yet to measure it, but the answer is measure it. So I think the public is educable on those issues if the industry practices keep up. The other thing, which I think 8 of our contributors say, is it's not enough for the large companies to say we have best practices when 40%, 50% of the operations in this country are conducted by small companies. So either industry's got to step up and say we're going to self-police like INPO or something else has got to give, but there has to be real movement there.
Frank, do you see that too? I mean, people often point to big companies versus small companies on the hydraulic fracturing, the shale gas.
So I think there's two pieces here, right? So the small companies, which are smaller number of wells and the way that they do things, right? But there's still state enforcement, whether you're big or small. You can argue about how rigorous the enforcement is. And I think that going back to Dan, your early point about how recent this is, I mean, this is less than 8 years old, right? So some states, when this started, there was 4 or 5 states that had really robust water safety, drilling, air emissions regulations, and now we're up to like 22 on the ones that count. But this has all happened over time, and it's evolved actually in terms of the industry in lightning fast speed. The practices in the field, and we're still learning about how to deal with the geology as well as the safety concerns. And I actually go back a little bit to Macondo, that the president was convinced by the spring of 2010 that we were going to need oil and gas, even as we transform the economy to cleaner fuels, right? The 40,000 wells had been drilled, no major accidents, technology was fantastic, and then we had this massive blowout. And then on the heels of that, we're drilling through aquifers, and the public goes, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I agree with David. I think the industry's response to that, so I don't know how many people saw Gasland, but the iconic scene in Gasland is the guy who turns on his tap and lights his tap on fire, which to me is cooking and cleaning at the same time, but that's just me. But it never comes across that he's drilled his water well through a coal seam, right? And then the industry puts out a 4,000-page bullet point rejoinder to Gasland, but no one reads that. You remember the scene in the movie. So the public education and the familiarity, I think, is just critically important, but stepping up to the plate and doing the right thing and upping your game is just, it's equally
Could I
important.
just add one other thing? Bill Riley, who was EPA administrator under Bush 1, has a wonderful chapter on safety.
And tell him what he did about Macondo, his role in Macondo.
Well, I'll let you add to that, but
That
because
he
you know a
chaired-
lot
he-
more
he
than
co-
I do
No, he
about that.
co-chaired the,
Chair the Deepwater
co-chaired the commission.
Co-chair of the
Yeah,
commission.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
I thought you
yeah.
meant,
He
historically.
did, no, he didn't drill any
Yeah,
wells.
absolutely. But in any event, his point is precisely what Frank's talking about, that, you can have all sorts of good practice, and then you have one bad apple, and it's for naught. And you really have to systematize your view of safety as integral to your business. And his chapter has a very interesting title to the effect of safety even when the markets don't care. Because, it may be that, your average analyst will not look at all your safety procedures. They will notice if there's a major problem. So what you need to do is ask yourself, are you willing to put in the extra investment, not just as a big company, and by the way, of course, Macondo is all about a certain big company that didn't do that, but also the small ones. And that gets into the self-policing, it gets into, frankly, uniform rules. And there's a debate, obviously, about whether the state should do it or federal or something in between, or whether industry can fill the gap. But, it's a big piece. One person asked us, why are you putting safety in a book about energy and security? Well, it's becoming more obvious with each incident. We have to address that and address it in a serious way.
So indeed, safety is part of security.
Right.
One last question before we open up to you all. As you read this, I mean, the thing about energy is, in all its manifold dimensions, it doesn't stand still. And so thinking about what's next and sort of what's kind of crept into your story is Mexico. And what kind of changes do we think might happen in Mexico, and what are the implications? Is Mexico not a new frontier, but if Mexico does open up its industry and modernize it, how does that change or affect the story, and what might we reasonably expect?
So I think it's huge in terms of potential. When we talk about the Eagle Ford doesn't stop at the border, or the Pearsall. So the ability to do onshore exploration, and you talk about the use of the United States and technology and partnerships, not only in the Gulf of Mexico, but in the onshore technology, I think would be extremely important to Mexico. It would reverse their decline They were our, second or third largest import source. But they're really in a situation where without increasing production, they will be in deficit and be a net importer. On the natural gas side, they're probably going to be our largest source, if they're not already, of our natural gas exports because of the pipeline situation. So we need to be cognizant of that. And my Mexican friends constantly point out the fact that when we talk about NAFTA, it's not just the U.S. and Canada, it's the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. So we'd all be kind of
Right.
well advised to consider that circle, which is a lot of things that you worked on.
Add anything to that, or?
I just think it'll have ripples around the globe. And I think if Mexico comes on as a major supplier and a non-OPEC supplier, then absent major disruptions elsewhere, that's going to push down the price of oil. And it's going to create a lot of pressure in the largely statist-run countries. So I think it's bad news for Venezuela. That would take a major change in other places.
I mean, it is interesting to consider that happening, improvement in Mexico and its energy sector at the same time that way Mexico is now regaining competitiveness with China because of wages and so forth, and industry manufacturing going to Mexico. It starts to point to a kind of a different picture for Mexico 3 or 4 or 5 years from now. Well, let's open it up to questions. The first question is to Dave Roginski, who's the director of the Wilson Center Program on Science, Technology, and Innovation. And do we have a mic that's prepared to rove? Right down here, down in front.
Question or comment?
Yeah, I had a question. I guess maybe I'll start with you, David. In the book, John Deutsch talks about the fact that we haven't had a significant national energy strategy. It goes back to the Carter administration. I think that's pretty well known. I always call over to DOE to my friends every year and sort of ask for the strategy. But what I hear you saying is maybe it's not that important anymore. I mean, maybe we should be shooting much higher to an international level. Or is the lack of a strategy actually a disadvantage as we start to have bilateral or multilateral negotiations, that we don't have a strategy of our own to sort of
Okay,
talk
David,
from?
why don't you take that question? Sure. I think it's for you.
Well, I think it's, we may not need a broad national strategy on energy, but I think in major sectors we still do. And Ernie Moniz, drawing on the PCAST study, said, in his chapter, and now with the Quadrennial Energy Review, we have got to deal with resiliency, adaptation, infrastructure, and the technologies of the future. We will never get to the destination of having those technologies if we don't have money and a priority and pathway to get there. So I think in that space, you absolutely need a strategy. In terms of promoting domestic supply, you have to have a strategy, and that's where our strategy has been low taxes and private ownership. And it's worked pretty well, but going forward, we've got to figure out, this is where exports come into it. I think you have to either be for them or not. You need a strategy there. But on foreign policy, I don't think you need a broad grand strategy. But those two spaces, and on demand restraint, we have the surplus. We have this providence because consumption is down, and we have had huge success in transportation and in consumption. So you need to get to the next level. That takes a strategy, legislation, and money. So I think, it may not be comprehensive, but it is a strategy, and you need it in the primary sectors, supply, demand, and technology.
Just add one thing. I would argue that in this time of great change, that it has to be flexible and adaptive, right? Because as you said, 5 years ago, we had one view of the world that's totally changed. And the other piece is, I think there needs to be more collaboration, right? So this is going to be, if the federal government doesn't have a lot of money, there's going to be a private-public sector collaboration, and we need to do more of that.
I would like to call on a Canadian. Oh, there's a Canadian, yes. Please identify yourself, and short questions, everybody.
Paul Connors, Canadian Embassy. Thank you for your presentation and the achievement of the second edition of your book.
Thank you.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the Saudi response to all of this. At CSIS a few months ago, the Saudi minister very blithely, in my opinion, or I took it blithely, said, yeah, U.S. production goes up, other production goes up, ours is going up, we're still selling what we want in the market. But you are suggesting that things are changing globally, and what I infer is that, in terms of relatively speaking, OPEC loses a bit in that. So are the Saudis just blithely, this is all fine?
Oh, that's a very subtle Canadian question.
So what about Keystone?
You answer that one. Okay, yeah.
So on the Saudi side, if you look at just normal decline rates, right, at current 4.5%, 5%, we're losing 4 million barrels a day per year, right? So if you fan out to 2030 or 2020, we have to replace that just to stay even. I would argue that we need everything at this point. And from the Saudi perspective, I think they welcome the shale gas technology, and I've talked to the minister about this, because they need to drill for shale gas and displace their oil use in power generation. I think they're less concerned about the price impacts. And just in the last 3 months, we have seen 3 million barrels a day of disruptions, OPEC and non-OPEC. And I would argue, and several of my colleagues at CSIS would argue, that OPEC, outside of a political institution, hasn't functioned well in 10 or 15 years. There's 4 or 5 countries you have to worry about, and the rest of them are kind of tangential, right? So from Saudi's perspective, if Iraq comes back, their big questions are, what does the United States do with Iran? Is there an accommodation? What do we do with a post-Chavez Venezuela in terms of policy? And do we really help Iraq get to the IEA's number, which I just can't see, of production potential? Because that's what changes the market. The U.S. has made enormous gains. In fact, our incremental production is the best of anyone in the world over the last couple of years. And Canada has, 177 billion barrels at $100 a barrel. That's exponentially larger than your GDP. So that's going to get developed. It's when, how fast, how high, how long, and what gets adjusted. And I think that there's enough geopolitical. If you go back, one other point, if you go back to what people were projecting for this year in terms of price collapse, when all this, demand hadn't grown yet, all the supply was coming on, if it wasn't for the U.S. growth, the additional Saudi production, and lower demand, we would have never been able to impact Iran sanctions. That's where I think the foreign policy
That's a
piece
very
comes in.
important point.
Yeah, I
to
mean,
make
that's
if
just
you
key.
do
So
the
it's given
numbers.
us more flexibility,
Right.
but I think we need everything.
I have to say, there's a little debate in the book between Ed Morse and Amy Jaffe, who really argue there are very serious challenges for OPEC, not for Saudi in particular, going forward.
That's true.
Because domestic demand, lack of investment, and then Shakib Khalil here in the front row takes the other side of that, who cautions OPEC's been pretty adaptable over its history, and don't sell them short.
You were former chairman of OPEC. Yes. Twice. So speaks with some authority on that, former Algerian minister.
Could I add
contributor
just,
to the book?
Just to add to that on the Saudi front, there are 2 other factors that must be in their minds. One is a fundamental shift in destination of exports. I mean, they're exporting eastward, and therefore they, are not particularly interested in picking fights with people in the other direction directly. And secondly, their strategic issue goes well beyond oil. I mean, to the extent that, there is this kind of neo-isolationist view in this country. We don't have to worry about the Middle East anymore. We don't have to fight anymore there. We have our own oil, let them stew in their own juices. To my mind, it's very short-sighted, but to the Saudi mind, this should be extraordinarily short-sighted. So the question is, where do our interests converge? And I think actually, far more now, and in the future, they're going to converge on larger questions of the world economy, of the regional stability, the kinds of things that we try to address in our book, the role of energy in a wider context, where the Saudis are not just exporting, but they're actually using more and more of their energy for production purposes, which correlates very much with what we want to do.
So, of course, it's also the West African countries who have been particularly hit by the increase in U.S. production, and they are rapidly reorienting towards Asia as their markets.
Right.
Other questions? The lady way in the back. Yes, you. Time is short, so I'll ask everybody to be short.
My name is Sabrina Medeiros. I'm Brazilian. I am professor at Inter-American Defense College. It's a pleasure to meet you all, sirs. It's a really pleasure.
Great. Give us a question.
Yes, I would ask you, we had denounced around spying Brazilian petroleum company, and also from Canadian agency, we had this week denouncements on spying our Ministry of Energy. So I would ask you, what about energy in terms of being a kind of challenge for the future of cooperation in terms of regional security? Thank you, guys.
What a big question.
It's a very big question.
Energy is great. I think the NSA is a problem for international cooperation, but I think the energy cooperation will survive it.
Okay. Nobody else is going to take on that question?
fine.
Just
I'll
leave
leave
that
it
with
at
David.
Okay, gentleman here. Nicely done.
40 years ago, 7 states produced more energy than they consumed, and American politics was very, very different. Today, the cost of campaigning has gone through the roof, and most politicians spend most of their time raising money. And they get that money increasingly from people who can't vote for them. What makes you think that American foreign policy or energy policy will be produced in America's interests?
Okay.
Either our national security interests or the popular interests.
Well, let me take a little bit of a crack at that by saying that as we become more energy self-sufficient, which I like much more, net self-sufficiency, which is not a political slogan, but is a useful thing to think about, we are going to be less dependent on good relationships with countries that we have fundamental problems with. We're going to be more focused on the kinds of things that we want to achieve. But the problem is that we have not got our act together here at home. I mean, think about the energy, the world of energy. You know, you have the presidents of China, Russia, European Union, the heads of all of these, they get involved directly in the question of energy transportation. We don't even have a point person in the White House, as was pointed out earlier, to deal with it. So you have this big country, the United States, sending unfortunate deputy assistant secretaries to compete with the likes of Vladimir Putin. And I think, we Americans ought to think a little bit more carefully about that.
Let's see, there's so many hands up in the back. I think
take 2 or
that
3.
gentleman back there, and then I think that, and I'll ask one last question. Sorry, we're just short of time to those who we won't get to, but there'll be a period afterwards. Go ahead.
It's not a very nuanced or sophisticated question, but
Can you identify yourself?
my name is Nicholas Boros. I work at TD International. If Keystone XL is built, what will the effect be on United States energy security? There you go.
It's funny, it's sort of that the energy security thing has kind of not been that much in the discussion, but fellows?
Greatly enhanced. From an energy security point of view, 700,000 barrels of oil from a neighboring non-OPEC stable country coming by pipe, not subject to weather or disruption from an energy security point of view, is, an unequivocal gift. Not that there are other trade-offs and other concerns, but from an energy security point of view, hard to do better.
Let me ask one last question. We've talked about the areas change in Mexico. What's the global significance of what's happening in East Africa in terms of energy development?
Well, it's going to shake up the gas markets, I think, by having Mozambique, Tanzania, that area as a major gas exporter right across from India. It may, if to the extent that there is oil there, it might have some impact also. And it's potentially very, very powerful for electricity access in Africa, but that's a very big jump to get the governance and the structure to be able to use that gas for electricity. But it's a great opportunity, at least I would say in that area, for South Africa. And on the other side, Liberia, Sierra Leone, that trend coming on adds to diversity of supply and net for Africa. That's a big plus.
May I just jump in that we have Philip Van Nierkerk, who has a great chapter on Africa, and you may want to grab him afterwards to talk about this issue in greater length.
Can I just add, so I totally agree with that position on that. I would just say that there's a potential downside, and the potential downside is that we seem to have moved from this arc of despair to optimism, and I'm afraid in some cases it's unbridled optimism, that the downside, and I use that really nuanced, but the downside of the unconventionals is that the opportunity pool's gotten so much larger that companies that maybe 8 years ago went around the world looking for places to invest, and countries coming off $150 oil that have the expectations that company X is going to invest, they're going to build infrastructure, educate my people, light my cities, and do all these wonderful things and sell low-cost energy to my population, when the investment profile was, let me develop a world-scale project that I can export to the world. As those dynamics change, you may see a slowdown in some of these projects. So I agree, the resource potential is there, it will get developed. I just think there's a timing issue here.
You know, I'm sorry, I can't, I guess there's one last question way in the back.
Steve Luckett. I study IR here in the city, and I'm also a producer in TV news. Thanks a lot, Dr. Yergin. Appreciate it truly. T. Boone Pickens was on CNBC this morning and noted that 8 million trucks on LNG could knock out 75% of OPEC. He essentially said that Keystone could make OPEC obsolete. Your remarks.
Keystone
Or, I guess, Keystone or natural gas in trucks.
No.
Yeah,
To both.
Yeah, no. It directionally is helpful. Yeah, directionally it's helpful, but no.
Right. So, listen, we have a book signing in the sixth floor atrium and a reception opportunity to talk to the authors and the contributors who are here. Invite you all to join us, and please join me in thanking our 3 panelists, our contributor, and our 2 editors.